The empire did not fall in 476. This is the first correction I want to make, because the story I want to tell you depends on it. The date 476, the year a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople. This date has become, in popular history, the date when Rome fell. The curtain came down, the lights went out, the ancient world ended, and the medieval world began. But in Constantinople, on the Bosphorus, where the eastern half of the Roman Empire had its capital, no one thought Rome had fallen. The emperor in Constantinople was still the Roman emperor. The Senate still met, the laws still ran in Latin, the armies still carried the eagles. The bureaucracy that had administered the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries was still intact, still functioning, still collecting taxes and issuing edicts and maintaining roads. The East had not fallen, the East had survived, and in the East, for another 1,000 years, something continued to call itself Rome, and meant it. Think about what this means. The Eastern Roman Empire in 476 was not a diminished fragment clinging to survival by its fingernails. It was the wealthiest, most urbanized, most administratively sophisticated political entity in the Western world. It controlled the richest agricultural land in the Mediterranean basin, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor. It controlled the trade routes between Europe and Asia at the one point on the map where those routes could not easily be bypassed. It had a professional bureaucracy, a professional army, a sophisticated legal system, a network of cities connected by roads and sea lanes, a monetary economy using gold coinage of consistent purity that was the reserve currency of the ancient world. When the western half fell, the eastern half did not merely continue, it prospered, relatively, in the absence of the military and fiscal burdens that the western provinces had imposed, and it remembered. The Eastern Empire in the 6th century carried with it a specific institutional memory of what Rome had been, what Rome was supposed to be, what Rome had encompassed when it was whole. The legal texts were still there, the administrative traditions were still there, the specific Latin ceremonial of the imperial court was still there, even as the spoken language of the East had long since shifted to Greek. The claim to authority over the West, over Italy, over Africa, over Spain, over all the territory that had once been governed from Rome, was not merely historical nostalgia. It was a live political claim, maintained in the diplomatic correspondence of Constantinople, acknowledged in the formal submissions of the Germanic kings who ruled the Western territories, who understood themselves, in most cases, as governing on behalf of the Eastern Emperor, rather than as independent sovereigns. The specific man I want to tell you about was born around 482, in a village in the Balkans, in the province of Dardania, in what is now the Republic of North Macedonia. His name was Flavius Petrus Sabatius. He was the nephew of a soldier named Justin, who had risen through the ranks of the imperial army to become, eventually, emperor. When Justin became emperor in 518, his nephew came to Constantinople and was adopted into the imperial family, taking the name by which history knows him, Justinian. He was not born to the purple. This matters. The phrase "born to the purple," referring to the specific purple dye of imperial robes that only the emperor's family could legally wear, meant something specific in the Byzantine world. It meant born in the porphyra, the purple room of the imperial palace where empresses gave birth. Justinian was not born in that room. He was born in a Balkan village to a farming family. His uncle had risen by talent and luck, and the specific brutality of frontier military service. Justinian would rise by intelligence and will, and a specific quality that the sources describe repeatedly but struggle to categorize. An absolute refusal to accept that the Roman world as it had existed was gone. He was not, by the accounts of his contemporaries, a particularly impressive physical specimen. The historian Procopius, who knew him personally, who served in his armies, who wrote both a public history celebrating his achievements and a secret history savaging his character, describes him as of medium height, neither thin nor fat, with a round face and a complexion that was rather pale. Not remarkable, not the kind of man who walked into a room and changed the air. But he worked, Procopius says, with an intensity that was almost frightening. He slept little, ate little, required almost nothing in the way of personal comfort, and he was awake and working when other men were asleep, and asleep, briefly, when other men were still working. He was at his desk before dawn. He received petitions until midnight. He read everything. He remembered everything. He was the emperor as bureaucrat, as administrator, as the specific kind of intelligence that does not dazzle but accumulates. And he wanted Rome back, not metaphorically, not as a cultural inheritance or a diplomatic claim. He wanted the actual territory: Africa, Italy, Spain, the western provinces that the Germanic kingdoms had carved up over the preceding century. He wanted them back under Roman law, under Roman administration, under the Roman emperor who sat in Constantinople and was, in his understanding, the only legitimate successor to Augustus and Trajan and Constantine. The West had been lost. It could be recovered. This was his conviction, and he pursued it with the specific patience of a man who believes that the world has an obligation to conform to what it ought to be. But before the reconquest, before the armies and the generals and the campaigns in Africa and Italy that would consume 2 decades of his reign, before all of that, there was Theodora. She was the daughter of a bear keeper at the Hippodrome. Her father's name was Acacius, and his job was to manage the bears that were used in the animal entertainments that the Constantinople crowd loved. The specific entertainments that involved wild animals and condemned criminals and trained fighters in the arena that sat next to the imperial palace and held 100,000 people. When Acacius died, his wife brought their 3 daughters to the Hippodrome and appealed to the competing factions, the Blues and the Greens, the organized supporter groups who were also, in effect, political parties and street gangs, for employment. The Greens ignored them. The Blues gave the widow a job. Theodora grew up in the Hippodrome world. She became an actress and a performer. And in the Byzantine world, actress was a term that carried specific social implications that fell somewhere between entertainer and prostitute, a point that her enemies would return to repeatedly throughout her life. She was, by multiple contemporary accounts, beautiful, funny, quick-witted, and entirely comfortable in the attention of men. She had a daughter whose father is not recorded. She travelled to North Africa with a man named Hecebolus, who had been appointed governor of the Libyan Pentapolis. And when Hecebolus abandoned her, she made her way back to Constantinople alone, by stages, through Alexandria and Antioch. Something happened in Alexandria. The sources are not clear about what, exactly, but the Theodora who returned to Constantinople from Alexandria was different from the woman who had left. She seems to have encountered, in Alexandria, communities of Miaphysite Christians, the specific theological tradition that understood Christ as having a single nature that was both human and divine, rather than the Chalcedonian position that Christ had 2 distinct natures. This was one of the great theological disputes of the age, and it was not merely theological. It mapped onto political and ethnic and regional identities in ways that made it explosive. Theodora became, and remained, deeply committed to the Miaphysite position. This would shape the rest of her life. When she came back to Constantinople, she was settled, self-possessed, done with the stage, living quietly, working wool. The sources mention this specifically, as if the domestic activity was meant to signal her reformed character. And she met Justinian. What passed between them in those early meetings is not recorded. What we know is that Justinian wanted to marry her, and that his aunt, the Empress Euphemia, refused absolutely to permit it. The law at the time forbade senators and their descendants from marrying actresses or women of the theatre. What we also know is that Justinian waited. He waited until his aunt died. Then he persuaded his uncle, the Emperor Justin, to change the law. And then he married Theodora around 525, 2 years before he himself became emperor. She was made Augusta, Empress, when he was crowned. Not a symbolic title, not an honorific, Augusta. Her image appeared on coins, her name appeared in official documents alongside his. When foreign ambassadors came to court, they prostrated themselves before both of them. She held her own court, she issued her own correspondence, she had her own political agenda, her own intelligence network, her own capacity to reward and punish. The sources that hate her, and several of them hate her with a venom that is itself informative, describe her as the real power, the puppet master, the woman who made Justinian her instrument. The sources that admire her describe her as his partner, the one person whose judgment he trusted absolutely. The truth, as best we can reconstruct it, is somewhere between. She was not more powerful than him, but she was genuinely powerful, and the partnership was real. In the specific moment that makes this clearest, the moment that would have ended Justinian's reign in its first year if Theodora had been a different kind of person, the partnership was everything. January 52, the Nika riot, the Blues and the Greens, the Hippodrome factions had been separately petitioning the emperor for mercy for prisoners under sentence of death. Justinian refused. At the games in the Hippodrome, the factions began chanting together, Nika, conquer. The chant was not directed at the barbarians, it was directed at the emperor. What began as a riot in the Hippodrome became, within hours, a city-wide insurrection. Constantinople burned, the palace district burned, the great church of Hagia Sophia burned, the first Hagia Sophia, the one that preceded the extraordinary building Justinian would later construct. A rival emperor was proclaimed. The mob controlled the streets. Justinian, by the account of Procopius, was ready to flee. The ships were prepared, the imperial treasury was being loaded, the court was in panic. And then Theodora spoke. Her exact words, as Procopius records them, have become among the most quoted in Byzantine history, and I will not reproduce them here at length, but the substance is this, that she would not flee, that she preferred to die as an empress than to live as an exile, that the purple made a fine burial shroud. Whether these are her exact words or Procopius's reconstruction of what she ought to have said is a debate that historians have conducted for 15 centuries. What is not debated is the outcome. Justinian did not flee. His general Belisarius was sent with the troops. The rival emperor and his supporters were cornered in the Hippodrome. The doors were locked. The soldiers went in. 30,000 people died in the Hippodrome that day. The number is almost certainly exaggerated, but the massacre happened, and after it, Justinian's position was secure, and the reconquest could begin. Belisarius. The name deserved its own moment, because without Belisarius there is no reconquest, and without the reconquest there is very little of the story of Justinian that justifies the word great. Flavius Belisarius was born around 505, also in the Balkans, and he had risen through the military establishment under Justinian's patronage. He was, by the testimony of multiple contemporaries who observed him personally and who had no particular reason to flatter him, a military commander of exceptional talent, calm under pressure, imaginative in his tactical thinking, able to maintain discipline in armies that were often hungry and unpaid and far from home. He was also, and this is the specific detail that makes him one of history's more poignant figures, absolutely loyal to Justinian, even when Justinian repaid that loyalty with suspicion, with underfunding, with recall at the moment of near success, with a final humiliation that left the greatest general of his age reduced and diminished in the last years of his life. In 533, Belisarius sailed for Africa with an army of approximately 15,000 men, a force that, by the standards of the campaign being attempted, was absurdly small. The Vandal kingdom of North Africa had been established for a century. It controlled Carthage, the great port cities of the African coast, and the agricultural hinterland that had once fed Rome. The Vandals were not, despite their reputation as the archetypal destroyers, the word vandalism derives from them, unjustly, a spent force. They were a functioning Germanic kingdom with a professional army. Belisarius destroyed them in 2 battles. The speed of the campaign is almost incomprehensible. He landed in September 53. By the end of the year, Carthage had fallen, the Vandal king Gelimer had surrendered, and Africa was back under Roman administration. The ease of it was deceptive. The subsequent pacification of the African provinces and the suppression of the various uprisings that followed would take years. But the main campaign was over in months. Justinian had his first piece of the West back. Italy was the prize. Italy, where the Ostrogothic kingdom ruled under the successors of Theodoric the Great, who had himself been a figure of extraordinary complexity, a Gothic king who had been educated in Constantinople, who understood himself as a Roman magistrate operating on the emperor's behalf, who had governed Italy with considerable competence for over 30 years before his death in 526. His successors were less capable. The Gothic nobility was divided, and in 535 Belisarius crossed from Africa to Sicily and began the Italian campaign. It would last 20 years. The speed of the African campaign had created a false expectation. Italy was not Africa. The Goths, once they understood that Justinian intended not accommodation but reconquest, fought with a ferocity and a coherence that the Vandals had not managed. The peninsula was fought over foot by foot, siege by siege, the same cities taken and retaken, the population ground between the armies, until the Italy that emerged at the end of the war was something different from the Italy that had existed at its beginning. Less populous, less prosperous, its agricultural and urban infrastructure damaged in ways that would take generations to repair. Rome itself was taken and lost and taken again. Belisarius held Rome against a Gothic siege in 537-538 that lasted for a year and 9 days, one of the extraordinary defensive sieges of the ancient world, conducted by a garrison that was perpetually undersupplied against a Gothic army that kept the city completely encircled. He held it. He had perhaps 5,000 effective soldiers. The Gothic army, by the estimates of the ancient sources, numbered in the hundreds of thousands, almost certainly an exaggeration, but the disproportion was real. He held the city by the specific combination of tactical intelligence, personal courage, and the willingness to take risks that characterized his generalship throughout his career. Justinian recalled him in 540. The war in Italy was not over, and Belisarius's recall, motivated partly by suspicion, partly by the need for him in the east where Persia was again threatening, allowed the Goths to recover. The Italian campaign dragged on. A new Gothic king, Totila, proved to be a military and political leader of exceptional ability, one who understood that the Byzantine reconquest could be challenged not just militarily, but by offering the Italian population, the Roman population, the people who had lived under Gothic rule for decades, better terms than they could expect from Constantinople. This is the specific irony at the heart of the Italian campaign. The people being liberated were, in many cases, not particularly grateful. The Byzantine armies requisitioned food, demanded taxes, garrisoned cities, and imposed administrative structures that were alien and expensive. Totila, by contrast, was generous with the Italian poor, freed slaves who joined his forces, and presented himself as a legitimate ruler rather than a foreign conqueror. The reconquest of Italy was, in the end, a brutalization of Italy, and the Italy that emerged from it was impoverished and depopulated in ways that shaped the peninsula for centuries. Belisarius was sent back to Italy in 544. He was sent without adequate resources, without adequate troops, without the logistical support that the campaign required. He did what he could. He was recalled again in 548. The final campaigns of the Italian War were conducted by the eunuch general Narses, who had the resources that Belisarius had been denied, and who completed the reconquest in 554, but who could not undo the devastation that 20 years of war had inflicted on the peninsula. Hagia Sophia. In the midst of all of this, the African campaign, the Italian War, the Persian campaigns in the east, the constant administrative effort of holding a vast empire together with laws and bureaucrats and gold, Justinian rebuilt the great church. The original Hagia Sophia had burned in the Nika riots. Justinian commissioned a replacement immediately, and what was built between 532 and 537, 5 years of construction involving, by the ancient sources, 10,000 workers, is the building that still stands in Istanbul, that still defines the skyline of the city as it has defined it for 1,500 years. That is, by any measure, one of the greatest architectural achievements in the history of the world. The challenge that the architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus faced was specific. Justinian wanted a building that had never been built before. He wanted a vast interior space, vast in a way that no previous building had been vast, surmounted by a dome. The dome was the problem. A dome of the scale Justinian wanted had never been placed over an open interior space of the scale Justinian wanted. The structural engineering of it, the specific problem of transferring the outward thrust of the dome to the walls and to the ground without the dome collapsing, required solutions that were, in the context of 6th century technology, genuinely innovative. The dome is 40 meters in diameter. It sits 45 meters above the floor. Its base is pierced by 40 windows so that the dome appears, from the interior, to float on light, the specific effect that the ancient sources describe as miraculous, as the dome suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The effect was not accidental. It was designed. The windows were positioned precisely to produce the specific quality of interior light that would make the space feel transcendent, that would make the worshipper feel, upon entering, that they had moved from the ordinary world into something else. Justinian, entering the completed church for the first time, is reported to have said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Whether he actually said this is uncertain. Whether it captures his feeling in the moment is not. The law, the reconquest, and the great church are what the popular imagination has seized on most firmly. But Justinian's most durable achievement was something less visible and more permanent: the systematic codification of Roman law. Roman law had accumulated over centuries: statutes, edicts, judicial interpretations, the opinions of legal scholars, into a body of material so vast and so internally contradictory that navigating it required specialists of extraordinary erudition. Justinian commissioned a team of lawyers under the direction of a man named Tribonian to rationalize this material, to remove contradictions, to compile the still valid law into a coherent and usable form. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, completed in a few years of intense work in the early 530s. A code, a digest of legal opinions, a textbook for students, and a collection of Justinian's own new legislation. The Corpus Juris Civilis is, without hyperbole, one of the most consequential documents in the history of human civilization. It preserved and systematized the Roman legal tradition at a moment when that tradition might otherwise have fragmented and been lost. When, in the 11th and 12th centuries, scholars at Bologna began to study Roman law seriously, it was the Corpus Juris Civilis they studied. The legal systems of most of continental Europe, French law, Italian law, German law, Spanish law, the legal systems of Latin America, descend from the tradition that the Bologna scholars recovered from the text that Tribonian's team compiled. The specific legal concepts, property rights, contract law, the distinction between public and private law, the presumption of innocence that underlie the legal practice of much of the world today, were transmitted through the Corpus Juris Civilis. Justinian did not know this would be his most lasting achievement. He thought it was housekeeping. He thought the reconquest was the thing. Theodora died in 548. She died of cancer. The sources say so specifically, though the nature of the cancer is not identifiable from the descriptions. She had been ill for some time. She was probably in her late 40s. The sources that admired her describe Justinian's grief as complete. The sources that hated her describe his relief. The truth is probably more complicated than either, because Theodora had been not just his wife, but his primary political ally, the person whose judgment he had trusted for over 20 years, the partner without whom the specific shape of his reign would have been different. She had used her position to protect Miaphysite communities, to support specific theological positions that Justinian himself did not always share, to maintain connections with the eastern provinces whose religious sympathies lay with Miaphysite Christianity rather than with the Chalcedonian orthodoxy that Constantinople officially professed. After her death, the theological tensions she had managed through her patronage became more acute. Without Theodora, Justinian aged. He was in his mid-60s when she died, and he would live for another 17 years, continuing to rule with the same intensity of administrative focus that had always characterized him, but without the partnership that had been the emotional and political center of his life. He became, in those later years, increasingly absorbed in theology, the specific theological disputes about the nature of Christ that had divided the church for centuries, and his attempts to resolve those disputes by imperial decree alienated the Western Church without satisfying the Eastern, and left the theological situation more fraught at his death than it had been at his accession. The plague. In 541, 9 years into his reign, a plague arrived in Constantinople from Egypt. It was, though no one in the 6th century knew this, the same organism that would devastate Europe in the 14th century, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium of the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, as it is called, killed. The estimates vary enormously, and the ancient sources cannot be trusted for numbers, somewhere between a quarter and half of the population of the empire over the decades of its recurrence. Constantinople alone, at the plague's height, was losing 5,000 to 10,000 people a day. Justinian himself contracted the plague and survived it. Whether the survival was luck, or the specific medical attention that an emperor could command, or some combination of both, is unknowable. He recovered. The empire around him did not recover, not fully. The plague struck at the agricultural and military manpower on which the reconquest depended, and the Italy in Africa that had been taken at such cost could not be held and administered with the resources that the plague-diminished empire could provide. The world that Justinian had tried to restore, the unified Mediterranean world under Roman law and Roman administration, was not recoverable. Not because his will failed, not because his intelligence failed, not because the armies failed entirely, but because the specific demographic and economic conditions that made the late Roman Empire possible were not reproducible in the 6th century by any effort of will. The West had changed too much. The agricultural surplus that had funded the Roman legions was not available. The population had been reduced by plague and by the devastation of the reconquest wars themselves. The administrative infrastructure that Justinian tried to reinstall in Italy found itself operating on a society that had been transformed by a century of Gothic rule and 20 years of brutal reconquest warfare into something that no longer fit the imperial administrative model. He was wrong about the possibility. He was not wrong about the attempt. He died in 565 in his early 80s, having reigned for 38 years. He had outlived Theodora by 17 years. He had outlived Belisarius by a year. Belisarius, who had been accused of conspiracy in his old age, stripped of his property and possibly blinded before being rehabilitated shortly before his death. The greatest general of the age ending in humiliation and then partial restoration in the last year of his life. The specific reward that incomprehensible loyalty to an emperor received. After Justinian, the reconquest slowly unraveled. Italy, which had cost 20 years and untold lives and the ruination of the peninsula to take, was largely lost to the Lombards within 3 years of his death. Africa held for another century. The specific achievement, the territorial reconquest, proved to be transient, its costs enormous, its permanence nil. But Hagia Sophia still stands, and the Corpus Juris Civilis is still the foundation of the legal systems of half the world. The specific melancholy of Justinian is the melancholy of the man who is right about what he values and wrong about what is possible, who spends his life in the service of a vision that is coherent and noble and genuinely connected to the best of what human civilization has achieved, and who cannot, despite everything, make the world conform to the shape it ought to have. The empire he tried to restore is gone. The reconquest he fought for is gone. The theological unity he tried to impose is gone. But the building that he commissioned in 5 years of frantic construction after the Nika riots, the building that was meant to be the physical embodiment of the Christian Roman Empire at its height, that building has been standing for 1500 years, and the morning light still comes through the windows at the base of the dome in exactly the way that Anthemius and Isidore designed it to come. Theodora's face looks out from the mosaic in the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, one of the great mosaics of the early Byzantine world, commissioned around 537, a year before her death. She stands in the apse, haloed, attended by her court, her expression unreadable, her eyes direct and dark. The artist has given her the posture and the accoutrements of imperial power, the crown, the jewels, the purple robe. But the face is specific, the face of a particular person who came from the Hippodrome world and ended in the apse of a church with a halo. She was the daughter of a bearkeeper. She became the Empress of Rome, the bearkeeper's daughter and the Balkan farmer's nephew, in the city on the Bosphorus that still called itself Rome, trying to reclaim a world that was already gone. They almost did it. The dome still floats on its ring of windows, still suspended above the nave as it has been suspended for 1500 years, still doing the thing it was built to do, making the specific quality of light that makes a person feel, upon entering, that they have moved from the ordinary world into something else. The empire is gone. The light is not. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me give you Constantinople itself, because without the city the story is incomplete. The city is not merely a backdrop, it is a character, the most important character after Justinian and Theodora, the specific physical fact that made everything else possible. Constantinople had been founded by Constantine the Great in 330 on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, at the precise geographical point where Europe meets Asia, where the Bosphorus narrows between the Black Sea to the north and the Sea of Marmara to the south. The city occupies a triangular peninsula, water on 2 sides, the great defensive walls on the third, and its position is so naturally defensible and so strategically situated at the crossroads of the major trade routes between Europe and Asia that Constantine's choice of location was one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the ancient world. By Justinian's time, Constantinople was the largest city in the world outside of China, a population that contemporary estimates put at somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people, a number that dwarfs anything in the contemporary West. It was a city of extraordinary diversity. Greeks and Syrians and Armenians and Egyptians and Goths and Persians and Jews and people from the furthest reaches of the empire and beyond, all living in the specific compressed proximity of a great city, all conducting business in the same markets, attending the same races at the Hippodrome, drawing water from the same cisterns, the cisterns. Beneath Constantinople lay an engineering achievement that the surface of the city concealed almost entirely from view, a network of vast underground cisterns that stored the water the city needed to survive a siege. The largest of these, the Basilica cistern, was built or expanded under Justinian and could hold nearly 80,000 cubic meters of water, enough to supply the city for months. It is still there, still intact, a cathedral of water beneath the streets of Istanbul, its forest of columns reflected in the dark water below, one of the most extraordinary spaces that the Byzantine world produced. The water that filled the cisterns arrived via an aqueduct system of remarkable length and engineering sophistication. The aqueduct of Valens, the great aqueduct visible in Istanbul today, carried water from sources 40 kilometers away into the city. The network of smaller channels and pipes that distributed the water through the city was maintained by a specific administrative apparatus whose sole function was the water supply, a detail that speaks to the specific complexity of urban administration that Constantinople required and possessed. The markets. The commercial life of Constantinople was organized around specific markets for specific goods. The fish market by the harbor, the grain market, the silk market, the spice market, the book market. The book market is worth dwelling on. Constantinople had a book market, a commercial space where manuscripts were bought and sold, where the accumulated learning of the ancient world circulated in physical form, where a person could purchase a copy of Plato or Thucydides or the collected opinions of the Roman jurists. The literacy rate in Constantinople was not what we would call high. Most of the population could not read in any sophisticated sense, but the city had enough literate people, enough educated people, enough people for whom books were essential tools of their trade or their religion or their intellectual life, to sustain a commercial book market. This is the specific texture of Constantinople that the political and military narrative tends to obscure. It was a city of readers and merchants and sailors and craftspeople and monks and bureaucrats and doctors and engineers, a functioning urban civilization of extraordinary complexity. And it was this civilization, not just the army, not just the emperor, that made the reconquest possible, that funded it and administered it and provided the legal and administrative framework within which it operated. The Hippodrome, the great arena that sat adjacent to the imperial palace, was not merely an entertainment venue. It was the specific space in which the relationship between the emperor and the people of Constantinople was conducted. The races, the chariot races that the blues and the greens organized and contested, were entertainment, certainly. But they were also politics. The emperor appeared at the races in his box, the kathisma, which connected directly to the palace so that he could enter and exit without passing through the crowd. The crowd could address him directly, could chant petitions, could express approval or anger, could, as in January 532, tip over into something that was no longer a sporting crowd, but a revolutionary mob. The factions, blues and greens, were, in their origins, the specific organized groups that managed the chariot teams, the stables, the drivers, the support staff, the specific infrastructure of professional chariot racing. But by Justinian's time they had become something more than this. They were the organized street presence of Constantinople's civilian population, the bodies through which political pressure could be organized and expressed, the groups that controlled specific neighborhoods and specific social networks. They had their own leadership, their own internal hierarchy, their own capacity for organized violence that was distinct from the imperial army. Justinian was a blue. Theodora had grown up in the Hippodrome world with the blues. It was the blues who had given her family employment after her father's death. The specific factional loyalty of the imperial couple was known, and it shaped the political dynamics of the early reign in ways that contributed to the tensions that produced the Nika riots. The Green faction felt frozen out, aggrieved, and their grievance found expression in the events of January 53 too. The specific reconstruction of Constantinople after the Nika riots was a massive undertaking. The riots had burned large sections of the city centre, the original Hagia Sophia, the Hagia Irene, the baths of Zosippus, large sections of the commercial district around the Augusteum. The reconstruction gave Justinian the opportunity to redesign the centre of the city, to replace the damaged buildings with structures that reflected his specific architectural ambitions and his specific understanding of what a Christian Roman imperial capital should look like. Hagia Sophia was the centerpiece, but it was not the only building. Justinian built or rebuilt dozens of churches across Constantinople and the empire. The sources attribute to him the construction or reconstruction of more than 24 churches in Constantinople alone. He rebuilt the Sacred Palace, the imperial residence that occupied the entire southeast corner of the city between the Hippodrome and the seawall. He built the Cult Gate, the great bronze-doored entry to the palace complex, surmounted by a mosaic depicting his military victories in Africa and Italy. He built the Augusteum, the great public square in front of Hagia Sophia, at the centre of which stood a column bearing an equestrian statue of himself in the guise of Achilles, the statue. It stood until the Ottoman conquest in 1453, when it was melted down. The specific image, Justinian on horseback, dressed as a Greek hero, facing east toward Persia, his right hand extended in a gesture of command, was described by Procopius in terms that convey both its scale and its specific iconographic program. Justinian had himself represented not as a Roman emperor in the traditional sense, but as a world conqueror, a figure of universal authority whose reach extended to the farthest horizons. The statue was propaganda, certainly, but it was also a sincere statement of self-understanding. He believed it. The Persian War. While the Western campaigns consumed the military imagination of the reign, the eastern frontier was never quiet. Persia, the Sasanian Empire, the great power that had contested Rome's eastern frontier for centuries, was a constant presence in the strategic calculations of Constantinople. The specific rhythms of Roman-Persian relations in Justinian's reign included periods of active warfare, periods of expensive truce, and the specific dynamic of two great powers who were too evenly matched to destroy each other and too geographically and commercially entangled to ignore each other. The great Persian king of the period was Khosrow I, called Anushirvan, the immortal soul, who came to the throne in 53 and who would reign for nearly 50 years. He was, by any assessment, one of the most formidable figures of the 6th century, a military reformer who reorganized the Sasanian army on a new logistical basis, a patron of learning who invited Greek scholars expelled from the academy in Athens when Justinian closed it to teach at his court, a legal reformer who rationalized Persian administrative law. He and Justinian were the two great protagonists of the age, the two figures who between them shaped the political and cultural landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East in the 6th century. Khosrow invaded Roman Syria in 540, taking and sacking Antioch, the third city of the empire, and carrying its population into captivity. He rebuilt a city for them near his capital at Ctesiphon, calling it Where Antioch Khosrow. Better than Antioch, Khosrow built it. The specific humiliation of this, the great city of Antioch sacked and its population relocated to a Persian duplicate, was enormous. Justinian bought peace with gold repeatedly in the specific practice that Byzantine diplomacy had elevated to a sophisticated art. Paying the Persians to stop fighting was cheaper than fighting them, and the gold that bought peace could be replenished by the economy of a functioning empire in ways that the losses of a losing war could not. The silk trade was one of the instruments of this calculus. Silk came from China, across the Silk Road through Persia, and the Persians controlled the specific choke points of the trade and could manipulate its price and availability in ways that disadvantaged Constantinople. Around 552, the sources are not entirely clear on the date, 2 monks arrived in Constantinople from Central Asia, carrying, hidden in the hollow handles of their walking staves, silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds. The specific story of how Byzantine silk production began has the quality of legend, and it may be partly legendary but the substance is confirmed by archaeology. Silk production in the Byzantine Empire began in the mid-6th century, reducing the dependence on Persian-controlled trade routes, and it became one of the most carefully managed industries of the later empire, with specific imperial workshops producing the specific grades of imperial purple silk that were among the most valuable commodities in the medieval world, Tribonian and the law. I want to return to the Corpus Juris Civilis because I gave it to you too briefly, and it deserves more. The man Justinian chose to lead the compilation was Tribonian, his quaestor, the chief legal officer of the imperial administration. Tribonian was, by the testimony of those who knew him, a man of extraordinary legal learning, systematic intelligence, and somewhat flexible personal ethics. The sources accuse him of selling legal opinions, of manipulating legislation for personal benefit, of the specific forms of corruption that are available to someone who controls access to the law. He was removed from office briefly during the Nika riots, when the crowd demanded the dismissal of several unpopular officials, including him. Justinian reinstated him within months. Whatever his personal failings, his legal intelligence was irreplaceable. The compilation was organized in three main parts. The Codex Justinianus, the Code, collected the valid imperial constitutions, the legislative pronouncements of the emperors from Hadrian to Justinian himself, purged of contradictions and organized by subject. The Digest, or Pandects, was the most extraordinary achievement, a systematic compilation of excerpts from the writings of the classical Roman jurists, the great legal scholars of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, whose opinions had the force of law, but whose works had never been systematically organized. The Digest assembled nearly 3 million words of legal opinion into a coherent, searchable reference work organized by subject. The Institutes was a textbook for law students, a concise introduction to the legal system organized for pedagogical purposes. The specific labor of this compilation, reading and excerpting and organizing millions of words of legal text in a few years, required a commission of 16 jurists working under Tribonian's direction, with a focus and a systematic method that was in the 6th century without precedent. They worked from the Imperial Library in Constantinople, which held the manuscripts of the classical jurists, many of which existed in single copies. They preserved in their excerpts texts that would otherwise have been entirely lost. The opinions of Ulpian and Paulus and Gaius and Papinian survive today because they were excerpted into the Digest, because Tribonian's commission thought they were worth preserving. The legal concepts that were systematized in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the distinction between civil law and the law of nations, the concept of legal personality, the specific rules governing property and contract and inheritance and delict, the procedural framework of Roman litigation. These are the foundation concepts of a legal tradition that has never been entirely abandoned. They were transmitted to the medieval West through the Bologna school, and from Bologna they went into the law of every country that received the Roman legal tradition, which is to say most of the world outside the common law sphere. Justinian, working through Tribonian, gave the modern world its law. He did not know this. He thought he was tidying up. He thought the reconquest was the achievement that would matter, the monks of Constantinople. While the armies fought in Italy and Africa, while the lawyers compiled the corpus, while the architects built Hagia Sophia, a separate and equally significant transformation was occurring in the religious life of the empire. Monasticism, the specific practice of withdrawal from ordinary life into a community dedicated to prayer and asceticism, had been developing in the Eastern Mediterranean since the 3rd century, and by Justinian's time it had become one of the dominant institutions of Byzantine society. The monasteries of the 6th century were not merely religious houses. They were hospitals, they were hostels for travelers, they were centers of literacy and manuscript copying. They were agricultural enterprises, they were the specific social institutions that provided for the old and the sick and the poor, in a society that had no other systematic provision for them. The specific role of the monastery in Byzantine social life was a role that no other institution filled, and Justinian's reign saw both the extension of imperial patronage to monasteries across the empire and the beginning of the specific legislation that regulated monastic life, that defined the rights and obligations of monks and nuns, that integrated monasticism formally into the legal framework of the empire. St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai, built by Justinian between 548 and 565, is still there, still functioning, still inhabited by monks, one of the oldest continuously inhabited monastic communities in the world. Its library contains manuscripts that are among the oldest in existence, including the Codex Sinaiticus, one of the earliest complete manuscripts of the Christian Bible, discovered there in the 19th century. The specific physical fact of St. Catherine's, still standing, still inhabited, still preserving texts that are 15 centuries old, is in the specific register of what survives, one of the clearest connections between the world of Justinian and the world of today, the Ravenna mosaics. I mentioned Theodora's portrait in San Vitale already, but the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna is itself worth a moment, because it is one of the places where Justinian's world is most immediately accessible, not through text, not through archaeological inference, but through the specific visual presence of the mosaics that cover the apse. Ravenna had been the capital of the Western Roman Empire in its last decades, the capital of the Ostrogothic kingdom under Theodoric, and after the Byzantine reconquest of Italy, it became the seat of the exarch, the imperial governor of the reconquered Italian territories. San Vitale was consecrated in 547 and decorated with mosaics that are, by the testimony of everyone who has stood before them, among the greatest works of art that the ancient world produced. On one side of the apse, Justinian, tall and frontal, haloed, flanked by clergy and soldiers, holding the golden pattern of the Eucharist. On the other side, Theodora, equally haloed, equally frontal, flanked by her court ladies, holding the golden chalice. The composition is identical on both sides. The emperor and the empress given equal visual weight, equal spiritual authority, equal formal dignity. Whatever the legal and social subordination of women in the Byzantine world, in the apse of San Vitale, Theodora and Justinian stand in the same relationship to the sacred. The faces, both mosaics are portraits in a specific sense. The faces are individual rather than generic. The features specific enough that we can say something about what these people looked like. Justinian, broad-faced, dark-eyed, a slight heaviness to the features, the expression authoritative without being cruel. Theodora, thinner-faced, the eyes large and dark and direct, the expression that I described before as unreadable. She looks at you without revealing what she thinks of what she sees. She was the daughter of a bearkeeper. The artist has given her a halo. The theological disputes. The last third of Justinian's reign was dominated, as I noted, by his increasingly obsessive engagement with the theological questions that had divided the Church since the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The specific dispute, whether Christ had one nature or two, the Miaphysite versus the Chalcedonian position, was not merely theological in the way that modern observers tend to understand theological disputes, as matters of abstract intellectual disagreement that sensible people can resolve by agreeing to disagree. In the 6th century, the theological position you held determined which bishop you followed, which liturgy you used, which community you belonged to, which political alignment you inhabited. Egypt was predominantly Miaphysite, Syria was divided, the Balkans and the West were Chalcedonian. Theodora had been Miaphysite. Justinian was officially Chalcedonian, but spent enormous energy trying to find theological formulas that would reconcile the two sides. He did not succeed. The specific theological formula he tried to impose, a condemnation of certain Chalcedonian texts that he hoped would make the position more acceptable to Miaphysites without abandoning Chalcedon, satisfied almost no one and alienated the Pope of Rome, who was imprisoned in Constantinople for refusing to accept it and who died there. The theological landscape at Justinian's death was, as I said, more fractured than it had been at his accession. This is one of the specific failures that make Justinian's reign a tragedy, rather than simply a triumph. He understood, correctly, that the unity of the empire depended on the unity of the Church, and he spent enormous political capital trying to achieve that unity, and he failed. The theological divisions he could not resolve would, 2 generations after his death, provide part of the cultural and political context for the extraordinary spread of Islam through the eastern provinces of the empire, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, whose populations found the new religion less theologically demanding and less politically coercive than the Chalcedonian orthodoxy that Constantinople had tried to impose. What remains? I have been circling around a question that I want to address directly. What does it mean that Justinian spent his life trying to restore something that could not be restored? What do we make of a man whose central project failed, whose armies took back territories that his successors could not hold, whose theological efforts produced schism rather than unity, whose plague-weakened empire emerged from his reign less capable than it had entered it. One answer is simply to say, he failed, and the legacy is the law and the building and the mosaics, and these are enough. They are, objectively, enough. The corpus juris civilis alone would justify a reign. Hagia Sophia alone would justify a reign. The two together make Justinian one of the most consequential rulers in the history of the world, regardless of the fate of the reconquest. But I think there is another answer, one that attends more closely to what Justinian himself understood himself to be doing. He was not trying to restore the past, he was trying to fulfill an obligation. The Roman Empire, in his understanding, was not a historical accident that had been terminated by historical forces. It was a divinely ordained institution, the vessel through which Christian civilization was to be preserved and extended, the specific political form that God had chosen for the governance of the Christian world. The loss of the Western provinces was not the natural result of historical change. It was a failure, a betrayal of an obligation, a condition that needed to be corrected. This understanding that the empire had a divine mission, that the emperor's responsibility was not merely to govern, but to fulfill the purposes for which the empire existed, is the specific intellectual and spiritual framework within which Justinian's extraordinary expenditure of effort makes sense. He was not a man who had miscalculated the possibilities. He was a man who believed that the possibilities were determined by God, and that God required him to try. Whether or not we share this belief, it produced Hagia Sophia, and it produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, and it produced 20 years of warfare that reunified the Mediterranean world for one last generation. These are the specific consequences of a specific vision, held by a specific man in a specific time, that burned itself out in the service of something it could not achieve and left behind, as the residue of that burning, works that 15 centuries have not been able to diminish. The light through the windows of Hagia Sophia, Theodora's eyes in the apse of San Vitale, the words of Ulpian and Papinian preserved in the digest, still shaping the law of half the world. The bearkeeper's daughter, the Balkan farmer's nephew, 38 years on the throne of what they called Rome. The empire is gone, what they made is not. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me take you deeper into the world of the 6th century, because the world into which Justinian was born, and which he spent his life trying to hold together, was one of the most complex and contested worlds that human civilization has produced, and I have given you the political and military surface of it, without giving you the texture beneath. The Eastern Roman Empire that Justinian inherited in 527 was not the Rome of Augustus, or even the Rome of Constantine. It had been through 2 centuries of crisis and transformation that had changed it in ways that the political continuity, the same imperial office, the same administrative structures, the same legal tradition, partly concealed. The population of the empire had contracted since the 3rd century. The urban civilization of the classical period, the dense network of prosperous cities around the Mediterranean, each with its baths and its theatre and its forum and its educated leisured class reading Cicero and Plutarch, had contracted. The economic integration of the Mediterranean that had characterized the High Empire, when grain and oil and wine and pottery and metal goods moved freely across the sea in quantities that sustained a genuinely interconnected commercial civilization, had contracted. What remained was still, by the standards of the 6th century world, extraordinary. Constantinople itself was the largest and most complex city west of China. Alexandria was still a great city. Antioch was still a great city. The East, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Asia Minor, was still relatively prosperous and populous, its agricultural productivity still sufficient to fund the imperial administration and the imperial army. The West, Italy, Africa, the Balkans, had suffered more, but Africa had recovered somewhat under the Vandals, and Italy under the Goths had been governed with more competence than its post-reconquest reputation suggests. But the trajectory was downward, and Justinian's reign, paradoxically, given his ambitions, accelerated the downward trajectory in specific ways. The reconquest of the West was paid for by the East. The plague ravaged the labor force and the tax base. The Persian Wars drained gold eastward. The theological disputes consumed political energy that might have been spent on administration. The Italy that was reconquered was a damaged Italy that then had to support the administrative costs of imperial governance, and it could not. Within 3 years of Justinian's death, the Lombards were moving in, and the Byzantine position in Italy was reduced to coastal strips and isolated cities. The Italy question. I want to linger here because the specific situation of Italy in the 6th century is one of the places where the gap between Justinian's vision and the reality of what was possible is most visible. When Belisarius arrived in Sicily in 535 to begin the reconquest, he was arriving in a territory that had been under Ostrogothic rule since 493, 42 years. A generation had grown up knowing no other government. The specific Italian senatorial aristocracy, the great landowning families that had survived the Western Roman imperial collapse and adapted themselves to coexistence with the Gothic kingdom, had, in many cases, found the Gothic arrangement workable. Theodoric had governed Italy through Roman administrative structures, with Roman administrators respecting Roman law for the Roman population. The specific day-to-day experience of being a Roman in Ostrogothic Italy was not dramatically different from the experience of being a Roman under the late Western Empire. The Goths were, in this arrangement, the military class, the federate warriors who provided defense, while the Romans were the administrative and economic class. Theodoric had made this arrangement work through a combination of personal authority, genuine administrative competence, and a specific political philosophy of accommodation that understood that the Gothic kingdom's legitimacy rested on its ability to maintain the Roman order it had inherited. His successors were less capable. The Gothic nobility was more fractious, and specific acts of violence, including the execution of the philosopher Boethius and his father-in-law Symmachus in 524 and 525, victims of accusations of treason that many contemporaries considered unjust, had damaged the relationship between the Gothic court and the Italian aristocracy. But the damage was not irreparable, and the reconquest, which was presented as liberation, arrived in a country that was not uniformly eager to be liberated. The specific irony of Belisarius's position during the Roman siege of 537 to 538 was that he was defending Rome, the eternal city, the city that gave his emperor's project its name and its justification, from a Gothic army that contained many men whose families had lived in Italy for 3 generations, men who understood Italy as their home and who were fighting to defend it from foreign invasion. The categories of Roman and barbarian, liberator and invader had become confused in the specific realities of the 6th century in ways that Justinian's ideological framework did not easily accommodate. Procopius understood this. His secret history, the Historia Arcana, the private account he wrote alongside the public wars and the public buildings, the account that he apparently did not intend for circulation during his lifetime, is a document of extraordinary interest, precisely because it says the things that the official history could not say. Procopius had been on the campaigns. He had seen what the reconquest cost. He had seen the populations of the Italian and African cities that had been through years of warfare, the burned farms, the empty villages, the roads that had been military corridors rather than commercial arteries, the specific human cost of Justinian's vision expressed in the faces of the people who had lived through it. In the secret history, he calls Justinian a demon. He calls Theodora worse. He describes a reign of terror, of arbitrary confiscation, of corruption so systemic that justice was simply unavailable to anyone without connections to the imperial court. The charges are excessive. Procopius's secret history is a document of personal bitterness as much as historical analysis, but the specific grievances it articulates are not entirely invented. The taxation required to fund the reconquest was real. The arbitrary behavior of imperial officials was real. The gap between the ideological presentation of the reign, the Christian emperor restoring God's empire, and the experienced reality of being governed by that emperor was real. Justinian was not a cruel man in the sense that some emperors were cruel, not personally sadistic, not a Caligula, but he was a man who believed that the end justified the means to a degree that made the means, in practice, very hard on the people who encountered them. The specific taxation that funded the reconquest, the specific legal changes that advantaged the imperial treasury, the specific enforcement of religious orthodoxy that persecuted communities who held the wrong theological views, these were not incidental to his vision, but instrumental to it, and the people who suffered them experienced the instrumentalization in their own lives, even if Justinian experienced it as a necessary cost of divine obligation. Belisarius in Italy. Let me go back to the siege of Rome in 537-538, because it deserves more than I gave it. Belisarius had entered Rome in December 5036, welcomed by the population, the Gothic garrison having evacuated rather than fight. The Goths regrouped under their king Vitiges and returned with what the ancient sources describe as an army of 150,000, almost certainly exaggerated, but the disproportion between the besieging force and the besieged was real. Belisarius had perhaps 5,000 effective soldiers. Rome had a perimeter of approximately 19 kilometers of walls, the Aurelian walls built in the 3rd century. 5,000 soldiers defending 19 kilometers of wall against an army of tens of thousands is not a situation that a conventional calculation of military possibilities would call defensible. Belisarius did not use conventional calculations. He understood, with the specific clarity of a very good military mind in a difficult situation, that the siege could be survived not by passive defense, but by active harassment, by constant sorties from the gates, by disrupting the Gothic siege works, by keeping the besieging army so continuously engaged that it could not concentrate its effort on any single vulnerable point. The specific tactics he employed, the mounted archers who could release arrows at high rate from the gates and withdraw before the Gothic infantry could close, were suited to his available forces in a way that suggests a man who understood what he had and used it with maximum efficiency. He also understood logistics, the supply of Rome during the siege, the specific question of how 5,000 soldiers and the civilian population of one of the world's great cities could be fed and watered through a year of siege, required the maintenance of supply lines down the Tiber and through a corridor to the port of Ostia that the Goths never quite succeeded in cutting. The management of the grain supply, the management of the water supply from the aqueducts, the management of the civilian population's morale during a year of blockade and periodic assault, all of this was Belisarius's responsibility, and he managed it. The Gothic siege failed. Vitiges pulled back in March 538, having lost the siege without a decisive engagement, his forces depleted by the constant attrition of Belisarius's harassment tactics and by disease in the marshy ground around Rome. It was one of the more remarkable defensive achievements in the history of ancient siege warfare, and it was conducted by a man who had been given inadequate resources by an emperor who was simultaneously funding the codification of Roman law and the construction of Hagia Sophia and the Persian frontier and the administration of the newly reconquered African provinces. The resources question is one of the things that makes the reign of Justinian so difficult to assess fairly. He attempted more than any resources could adequately fund. The reconquest and the legal compilation and the building program and the Persian frontier and the Balkan fortifications and the theological councils and the administrative reform, these were all happening simultaneously, drawing on the same treasury, the same manpower, the same administrative capacity. The fact that as much was accomplished as was accomplished is in one sense a tribute to the extraordinary quality of the people Justinian had around him. Belisarius and Narses in the military sphere, Tribonian in the legal sphere, Anthemius and Isidore in the architectural sphere, John the Cappadocian in the administrative sphere. The fact that the strain of attempting so much simultaneously eventually produced the crises, the plague, the fiscal exhaustion, the demographic contractions, that undid much of what had been achieved is, in another sense, the indictment. John the Cappadocian. This figure deserves a moment because he is one of the people around Justinian who is most illuminating about the specific character of the reign. John was Justinian's Praetorian prefect, in effect his chief administrative officer, the man responsible for running the imperial government's day-to-day operations and above all for raising the revenue that funded everything else. He was, by universal testimony, brilliant and brutal, a man of low birth who had risen through the administrative apparatus, who understood the fiscal machinery of the empire in extraordinary detail, who was completely ruthless in his methods of tax collection, and who used his position of near absolute administrative power for systematic personal enrichment on a scale that was remarkable even by the standards of late Roman official corruption. He and Theodora hated each other. The sources suggest that the hatred was mutual and genuine, rooted in a specific conflict about the direction of the regime. John believed that the fiscal sustainability of the empire required abandoning the reconquest, that the costs of the Western campaigns were unsustainable. and Theodora, who disagreed, eventually engineered his downfall in 541. The specific manner of his downfall is one of the more lurid episodes of the reign: a night meeting, an entrapment, accusations of plotting against the emperor, exile. He was eventually allowed to return to Constantinople, but his power was broken. Whether Theodora was right to bring him down, whether the empire would have been better served by a more fiscally cautious approach that abandoned the reconquest in exchange for solvency, is one of the great counterfactual questions of Byzantine history. The plague arrived in 541, the same year as John's fall, and its demographic and fiscal consequences made the question moot. The revenue base contracted regardless of policy, and the reconquest became unsustainable, not because of Justinian's choices, but because a third of the population was dying. The Basilica Cistern again. I keep returning to specific physical things, specific surviving objects, because they are the specific way in which the 6th century remains present. The Basilica Cistern is one of the most extraordinary of these. You enter it from a nondescript building in the Sultanahmet district of Istanbul, descending a staircase to a space that opens below the city into a cathedral of water and stone. The ceiling is supported by 336 columns, arranged in 12 rows of 28, each column about 9 meters tall, rising from the water below. The columns are ancient. Most of them were taken from earlier Roman buildings, reused in the cistern's construction, so that their capitals are of different styles, Corinthian and Doric and Ionic mixed without apparent system. The architectural order of the classical world, repurposed for a functional underground space. At the far end of the cistern, 2 columns stand on pedestals that are the upturned heads of Medusa, the snake-haired Gorgon of Greek mythology, whose gaze turned people to stone. Why are they there, these Medusa heads, upturned and sideways, repurposed as column bases in a Byzantine cistern? The functional answer is that they were available. Cut architectural elements from earlier buildings, reused for their size and shape. But the specific image, the petrifying gaze now directed downward into the water, the mythological creature repurposed as support for a Christian city's water supply, has a quality of accidental poetry that is characteristic of the Byzantine world's relationship to its classical inheritance. The water is dark and still in the cistern. Carp drift through it in the darkness. The columns are reflected in the water below, doubling downward. A person standing on the walkway between the columns, in the specific quality of light and shadow and reflected light that the cistern produces, feels the weight of 15 centuries in a way that the surface of Istanbul does not quite manage. Justinian built this, or expanded it, or had it built under his reign. He did not think of it as a tourist attraction or an aesthetic experience. He thought of it as infrastructure, as the specific engineering solution to the specific problem of supplying a besieged city with water. But it is still here, still full of water, still carrying the aesthetic weight of its own existence, in a way that the reconquest of Italy, which lasted 20 years and cost many lives, does not. The empire that Justinian tried to restore is gone. The water is not gone, the dome of Hagia Sophia. I want to end where Justinian himself, entering the completed church for the first time, ended, in the specific quality of light that falls through the 40 windows at the base of the dome. The dome is 40 meters in diameter. It sits 45 meters above the floor on 4 enormous piers, transferred from there to the walls by the specific structural system that Anthemius and Isidore designed to make the impossible possible. The 40 windows at the dome's base are positioned in a continuous ring so that light enters from all directions simultaneously. The effect, on a clear day, is that the dome appears to float, the continuous band of light at its base, severing the visual connection between the dome and the structure that supports it, making the dome seem to hang in the air as if supported by nothing visible. The nave below is vast in a way that no earlier building had been vast. The Pantheon in Rome, the greatest domed building of the ancient world, has an interior diameter of about 43 meters, comparable to Hagia Sophia's dome, but the Pantheon's dome sits on solid walls that press down on the viewer. The interior of the Pantheon is magnificent but enclosed. The interior of Hagia Sophia opens upward and outward in a way that the Pantheon does not, the semi-domes on the east and west extending the space before it rises to the dome. The galleries on the north and south providing multiple levels of visual interest, the whole space organized to make the movement of light its primary architectural material. The mosaics that would cover the interior were added over the following centuries. The great mosaic of Christ Pantocrator in the dome, the images of the Virgin and the Apostles and the Emperors in the galleries, but the building as Justinian knew it, before the mosaics were added, was already one of the most extraordinary interior spaces that human beings have produced. The gold of the mosaic background that would eventually cover most of the wall surfaces was anticipated in the gold of the original decorative scheme, and the light that fell through the dome windows onto the gold reflected and multiplied itself in a way that the ancient sources describe as supernatural. Procopius, who was there to see it, wrote, "One would say that the interior is not illuminated from without by the sun, but that the radiance comes into being within it." He had seen the armies in Africa and the sieges in Italy. He had seen the plague in Constantinople. He had seen the court of Justinian and Theodora from close range, and had formed views about both of them that he committed to the secret history. And standing in the nave of Hagia Sophia, he could only say that the light came from within. He was not wrong. The light does come from within, in a specific architectural sense. The windows are positioned to catch the light at every angle of every time of day, and the gold and marble surfaces reflect it, until the distinction between the light entering the windows and the light generated by the reflections becomes difficult to maintain. The building is an instrument for transforming external light into interior radiance, and it still works. 15 centuries after Anthemius and Isidore designed it to work. Justinian entered it for the first time in December 537, when the dedication ceremonies were held. He had been emperor for 10 years. He had commissioned the building 5 years before, immediately after the Nika riots had burnt the original church. He had watched it rise while the Italian campaign ground through its first difficult years, while Belisarius held Rome against the Gothic siege, while the Persian frontier demanded constant attention, while Trebonian's commission worked through the classical legal texts in the imperial library. He had built it while everything else was also happening, the dome rising above Constantinople as the armies moved across Africa and Italy. The specific audacity of the construction, a statement about what he believed the empire was and what it owed to God. He walked in, he saw the dome floating above him on its ring of windows. He said, "If the sources are right, if the words are his and not a later attribution, Solomon, I have surpassed you." Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, the specific dwelling place of God in the Hebrew tradition, the building that represented the highest aspiration of a civilization to house the divine within a human structure. Justinian, standing in the nave of Hagia Sophia, claimed to have built something greater. Whether he was right is a matter of theological and aesthetic opinion. What is not a matter of opinion is that Solomon's temple is gone, and Hagia Sophia is not gone. The bearkeeper's daughter stands in the apse of San Vitale with a halo. The Balkan farmer's nephew stands in the nave of Hagia Sophia in December 537, looking up. 38 years they held it together, the two of them, in the specific way that two people of very different origins and very different histories can hold something together when they share the same conviction about what it is for. She died in 548. He died in 565. The empire they ruled is gone. The building they built is not gone. The law they compiled is not gone. The light that comes through the dome windows has been coming through the dome windows for 1500 years, and it will continue to come through them after every name in this story has been forgotten. The empire is gone. What they made is not. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.